The small room in City Hall was soon packed with instruments, leaving no suitable space for autopsies. In the coming weeks, the men had to conduct the procedures in funeral homes and in the rooms where the bodies were found. Their laboratory complete, the doctors took the first tour of Chinatown, accompanied by police officers. The district was shockingly unsanitary, they would later write. Its rooms are small. They are often entirely devoid of light or means of ventilation. Many of them are filthy. Some of them, especially those situated in basements, are damp and emit a foul stench. Prostitution was rife, allowing several venereal diseases to spread without constraint. Even so, they noted with grim irony the rooms in which the prostitutes lived were on the whole more wholesome in some regards, such as airspace, light, ventilation, and cleanliness, than those of the other inhabitants of the district. On their 10th day in San Francisco, they found their first plague victim, the body of Chu Ah-Chon, a 44-year-old actor, was discovered in a room above a theater in 814 Washington Street and carted to a nearby undertaker's shop. The commission members examined the corpse in a dimly lit back room. Large bluish spots, a sign of internal bleeding that was often present on plague victims in India, dotted the man's legs, while the glands in the neck, groin, and armpits bulged. Typically, such clear evidence of plague would have pressed the doctors into conducting an immediate autopsy. Yet, owing to the protests of their Chinese interpreter, who voiced his revulsion at any form of bodily mutilation, they agreed to make only the minimal incisions required to take tissue samples. They rushed the material back to their City Hall laboratory where Novoy, like Kenyon before him, inoculated a guinea pig with cultures he isolated from the man's body. The animal soon developed symptoms of plague and died a few days later, confirming that Chu was the 26th known victim of the epidemic. Plague was present beyond possible doubt, Novoy wrote in his notebook. Perhaps recognizing that the men he was working with were more willing to respect Chinese customs than Kenyon, who could concede nothing in search for his medical evidence, their interpreter soon informed them of several people suffering with apparent plague symptoms, whose identities were known to the Chinese 6 companies, but who had remained hidden from the Western health officials. The commission members examined more than a dozen patients, marking the first time that living carriers of the disease were officially recorded. Tom Shawn, a 51-year-old male actor and the roommate of Chu Ah-Chon, seemed lost in a stupor of delirium when the commission doctors arrived at his apartment. Surprised that the man was still alive, Barker examined him. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, and he winced when doctors put pressure on the enlarged glands in his groin. Though there were no buboles present, Parker told the man's friends that a dose of the Halfkeen serum was the only hope for his survival, though he cautioned that it might be too late. Shawn's friends refused the offer, and he died the following morning. Tissues taken during a partial autopsy revealed plague. Days later, the doctors descended into a cramped, filthy hotel at 921 DuPont Street, where they found Nig Ah Bak, a 45-year-old Chinese man who had been ill for 2 weeks with a high fever. Though friends present said that his mind no longer seemed anchored in reality, the man felt well enough to attempt a conversation as Barker began examining him and soon discovered a dark bubole bulging from his neck. The next day, Nig's body was found outside a coffin shop on Sacramento Street, apparently dumped there by men Barker had conversed with in the tiny shared apartment. An autopsy confirmed that he had died of bubonic plague. Not all cases were obvious. Fong Ah Fong, a 12-year-old girl living at 747 Sacramento Street, showed no outward signs of plague when the doctors first examined her. The girl had been ill with a low fever for 2 weeks, her mother said, yet her temperature had not spiked, and there was no evidence of inflammation in her glands. Suspecting that it was not plague and more likely a mild case of typhoid, the doctors asked her mother to contact them if the girl got worse. She died just a few days later. Confused by the sudden decline, the commission members returned to the apartment to examine the body. Finding no buboles, they pressed her mother to allow them to conduct an autopsy, explaining that it was the only way they could determine if the girl had contracted the disease and where the infection had been hiding in her body. The room suddenly filled with angry men and women, all violently objecting. Facing what he later called an appalling outbreak of grief, Barker promised to make only one small incision at the groin of the dead girl in order to capture a tissue sample, which confirmed that she had indeed died from plague. In the face of the strong protest made by the Friends, it seemed wise not to antagonize the Chinese too much, and so interfere with the progress of the whole investigation. Barker later wrote in the Commission's official report, apologizing for what he called the limited anatomical evidence collected from victims. Fong's death marked the sixth case of plague the Commission had identified in Chinatown within a single week, and brought the official number of dead to 26 in 10 months. Only 2 of the victims discovered by the Commission developed buboes on their body, requiring Novoy's laboratory to work for a true determination of the cause of death. It is difficult to make a diagnosis of plague without bacteriological examination, he later wrote. In the absence of primary buboes, the unskilled observer will miss practically every case, and even the practitioner who has had much experience with plague may be deceived. While unanimous in their belief that plague was indeed endemic in Chinatown, the doctors nevertheless remained puzzled. In every other outbreak of the disease, plague had spread like a great tidal wave with unusual force. Novoy wrote, "Yet in San Francisco it remained constrained by some invisible hand, even if the true death toll was likely far higher than the official record. And an unknown factor, was saving the city from devastation, but none of the doctors could even guess at what it was. Their only hope was that the disease would continue its strange pattern until a sanitation campaign could fully eradicate it, sparing San Francisco from the devastation they had seen in India." The Commission members met privately with Governor Gage at the Palace Hotel. Plague was indeed spreading within the city, they told him, and they had witnessed it in victims before their deaths, a phenomenon that Gage considered impossible. The governor grew irate, accusing the men of infecting victims with plague themselves through their careless handling of germs. He demanded to know whether they had been influenced by Kenyon, and raged even more when told that Kenyon was not involved. Shortly before they left the meeting, the doctors told the governor that they were close to finishing a full report that would confirm the presence of the disease in San Francisco, which they would send to Washington in the coming days. Governor Gage immediately wired a letter of protest to the Treasury Department, which at the time oversaw all matters of public health, railing against the publication of an investigation he called unjust and unfair. Should the document make its way around Washington and into the hands of a reporter, Gage knew that the state's economy, still dependent on its reputation as a mythical land apart from the ordinary concerns of the nation, would collapse. Whatever difference of opinion may at this time exist as to the existence or non-existence of plague, no one can honestly be of the opinion that the disease is epidemic in San Francisco, nor can anybody seriously contend that ample protective and preventative measures cannot be taken in the premises without even spreading great or any alarm among the people and without disturbing our commercial affairs, Gage wrote. He followed it up with a second telegram in which he demanded a private meeting between the congressional representatives of the state and the Surgeon General Wyman before the report was publicly released. Gage did not know it, but he was not alone in his attempt to keep the truth from spreading. In Washington, Wyman was also intent on suppressing the news circulating among medical researchers that the disease had been confirmed in California. Worrying that a wire service reporter would pick up on the rumors and write an article that would be reprinted across the country, Wyman refused to talk about the Commission's findings with subordinates, even though he trusted that plague was indeed in the city as he had described. He instead harbored a hope that, with delay and denial, he could bring the governor around to work with us, he wrote in a private letter to a colleague, making the task of eradicating the disease easier. His greatest fear was that a copy of the full report would be published, further inflaming a man intent on making it impossible to conduct modern medicine in his state. Back in San Francisco, Gage arranged a confidential meeting of the city's power brokers, the editors of San Francisco's largest papers, the president of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and attorneys for the Southern Pacific Railway, a group that collectively controlled the news that San Franciscans read, the goods that appeared on their docks, and the trains that connected them with the nation. Listened as Gage described the harm that publication of the Commission's report would pose to their futures. He had each man present promise to refrain from me publishing or acknowledging any reports issued by the Plague Commission, even after they were released by the federal government. Assured of a news blackout, Gage then assembled a delegation that immediately headed to Washington to press for the permanent suspension of the Commission's report and any federal mention of the plague in California. The group included the editors of the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Bulletin, the San Francisco Examiner, and the chief counsel for the Southern Pacific Railway, and the president of Union Iron Works, who happened to be a close friend of President McKinley. Unlike the secret pact among the newspapers to hide the news of the plague, the men Gage picked boasted that they intended to rid the city of federal health officers who had caused problems for too long. As he boarded the train for Washington, John P. Young, the editor of the Chronicle, announced that he would return with Kenyon's scalp dangling from his belt. Surgeon General Wyman met with the California delegation and presented them with copies of the Commission's final report, which had yet to be published. It concluded that plague was not only in San Francisco, but had likely been in the city for at least 2 years. The doctors could point to no reason why the city had thus far been spared the epidemics that had wasted Bombay and Hong Kong, yet they remained certain that it was only a matter of time. And San Francisco was not the only city at risk. The inability of health officers to forcefully confront the disease had most likely allowed it to expand to other large cities, including Sacramento and Los Angeles. If the disease was not confronted, the report declared, an epidemic could soon envelop the country. The findings were plain and sobering. Faced with hard evidence that the plague was not a hoax or the result of Kenyan mishandling tissue, the California delegation abandoned its efforts to undermine the doctors who served on the commission. While careful to maintain that they did not officially acknowledge the report's findings, the delegation offered a bargain. The city and state would pay for a full sanitation campaign in Chinatown, which would identify and treat plague victims and eliminate any trace of the disease, in exchange for the promise that the Commission's findings were never made public. After all, they argued, the only thing that could save lives now was the sort of sanitary response that Marine Health Service officials had long wanted but never had the support of the city or state to conduct. Why make the process more difficult by publishing a report that could lead to a panic? Sensing that the deal offered a chance for his agency to save face in California, as well as quelling an open challenge to his agency's federal authority, Wyman agreed, assuring that the delegation that the Commission's report would not be published while he remained Surgeon General. Left unsaid was that Kenyon would never go along with such a plan. Before the meeting was over, Wyman told the men from California to consider Surgeon Joseph White, one of his senior agents, the officer now in charge of the Angel Island outpost. He then composed a telegram to Kenyon informing him that he was being transferred to Detroit. There would be none of the public vindication that Kenyon had desperately sought. But Wyman counseled him to put the duty of his office to save lives ahead of his pride. The conferences have been harmonious, without personal or other accusations being made, and cooperation of all concerned is assured, he wrote. Public exigency requires personal feelings and any desire on part of the Bureau, the Marine Health Service, or any others for public verification of statements made or position taken must be subordinated to maintain the present attitude of non-publication, even though outsiders may have published some facts not obtained through the Bureau. The Department and the Bureau and its officers will maintain this attitude until further orders. Kenyon considered it Wyman's final betrayal. This time, however, Wyman's duplicity had not only hurt him personally, but harmed millions of unsuspecting men and women across the country who did not know that the Surgeon General was complicit in a plan to keep the truth from them. Kenyon believed in a future where scientists like him had rendered the concept of infectious diseases moot, sparing the lives of innocent people. Instead, he had to face a present in which politics mattered more than honesty, and ignorance wiped out at the insistence of a few politicians is not only humiliating to the officers of this service, but a calamity to the nation, he wrote to a friend. Despite Wyman's best efforts, a copy of the Commission's report was leaked from the Marine Hospital Service and reached the Occidental Medical Times, which published it in full. The Sacramento Bee then revealed the secret meeting in Washington that had kept the Marine Hospital Service from publishing the report, calling it an infamous compact. Medical officials were shocked to read not only the details of how plague had established itself in a major city, but that San Francisco had thus far been successful in concealing it from its own citizens. With Wyman's blessing, the federal government had intentionally helped California deceive the country, allowing thousands of Americans to travel to the state unaware that they were putting their families in danger. Their trust in California broken, health authorities in other states began prepping quarantine measures that they hoped would prevent plague from spilling across their borders. I have but little confidence in California authorities, and unless I have a positive assurance from you that this state will be carefully protected by you from the disease, I shall immediately order the most stringent quarantine regulations, wrote Joseph Sayers, the governor of Texas, in a personal telegram to Wyman. Please answer by wire immediately, as I will take no risk. Though his deception was now well known, Wyman refused to apologize. He had done what he considered necessary to coerce California into funding the costly cleanup campaign it needed, and that, and nothing else, was what would protect the country. To secure this harmonious action and its continuance, I have felt convinced of the necessity of not giving out for publication all the facts in the case, Wyman wrote in a letter to state health authorities across the nation. In a gesture of openness, he enclosed with it one of Kenyon's reports on the spread of the epidemic in San Francisco that had previously been pulled from the weekly Public Health Reports Bulletin. By avoiding unnecessary publicity, I feel that the actual necessary work has been and will be made possible and expedited, Wyman wrote, not allowing himself to feel shame. As he counted down his days in San Francisco, Kenyon vowed to make the most of them. He accepted invitations to appear at medical societies throughout the state, where he spoke at length about his experience fighting to be heard in a city that did not wish to acknowledge reality. In front of packed halls of doctors and public health officers who had never seen a plague, he discussed how the disease presents itself in the body as a victim edges closer to death. He confessed that he did not understand why the city's death toll was not much higher. In epidemics in Hong Kong and Sydney, it had taken no more than a year after the discovery of the first victims for the disease to show its full strength, and San Francisco was now already well past that point. The odd behavior of the disease, in which it appeared to select individual victims rather than flooding through a neighborhood, could change at any moment, he cautioned, and the city was still not prepared. He grew the most animated when he returned to the harder truths he had learned. When he first arrived in California, he had expected to see a city. When he first arrived in California, he had expected that a city would always put its safety above its ambition, he said. Only now did he realize how naive that was. Any doctor who followed through on his public responsibility to report plague cases must be prepared to be made a target by subsidized press simply because he has had no more sense of duty than to tell the truth, Kenyon told an audience of doctors in Sacramento. He then quoted none other than Wyman from an address the Surgeon General had made that year regarding cities that attempted to suppress reports of cholera. It is consistent with every known law of God, of every principle of sound policy and of well-being. I'm backing up to I'm going to start at that paragraph again. Kenyon then quoted none other than Wyman from an address the Surgeon General had made the year before regarding cities that attempted to suppress reports of cholera. It is inconsistent with every known law of God, of every principle of sound policy, and of well-doing among men that an individual or city or state can successfully protect itself behind the flimsy barrier of a lie, particularly in dealing with the phenomena of nature. Wyman said, if a case of cholera occurs in a city and be hidden under the disguise of a simple intentional derangement to avoid public clamor and injuries to the commerce and avenues of the state, the last hope of destroying the contagion is wiped away, and thousands of lives and the general ruin of industry must pay the penalty of a sordid, short-sighted, wretched policy. Kenyon left it up to his audience to determine whether a lie to cover up the plague was somehow better than a lie to mask cholera. There was no reason to believe that the state would follow through on its compromise with Wyman, Kenyon warned. The Plague Commission had found 6 confirmed cases in less than a week during its short investigation, but there had been no new victims identified since the deal was struck in Washington, and the Gage administration had already started to suggest that it might not fund the cleanup effort as promised. Plague was in San Francisco and, like all truths, would spread whether California doctors wanted to admit it or not. At the end of his speech, Kenyon relayed a remark once made on the floor of the state Senate by Senator Cutter, the man who had stated that Kenyon should be hung for his attempt at quarantining the state. Only with Kenyon's removal, Senator Cutter said, could the people of San Francisco sleep undisturbed and by day follow their avocations without fear. Now that the state appeared to get what Cutter had wished for, California was free to enjoy the bubonic plague to its full fruition, Kenyon said. There was no disguising his bitterness. As he packed his belongings at Angel Island and prepared his family to move again, Kenyon could only look back over the last year with half anger. He had once been a rising star who made his name by saving the lives of others. Now he found himself once more headed to an inglorious posting, where none of his brilliance in the laboratory would matter, simply because he could not allow himself to play the game of politics if it meant watching people die and doing nothing. Even after his demotion, Kenyon had continued to send reports to Washington, estimating the spread of the disease. Wyman replied just once, telling him that all future communications should be sent via Joseph White. Kenyon considered resigning his post rather than appear comfortable with Wyman's deceptions, but he was swayed by the pleas of fellow Marine Hospital officers. "Don't do it, old man," wrote Henry Rose Carter, who had played a key part in establishing that mosquitoes spread yellow fever and who remained one of Kenyon's closest friends. "You are one of the men who helped make this service. Believe me, your life and good works will never be lost." With his future in the Marine Hospital Service ruined, Kenyon's sole consolation was the response of other medical professionals to his courage. It is well studied the plan of Dr. Wyman, and in fact others, to simply regulate me to oblivion. And because of the prominence which my laboratory work had been assuming in the last 5 or 6 years, Kenyon wrote to a friend, it is most natural for a weak man, such as Dr. Wyman appears to be, to resent any such prominence of his subordinates, and therefore desires to regulate us to places where we cannot be so prominently before the public. There is one thing, however, that Dr. Wyman nor anyone else in the Marine Hospital Service can take away from me, and that is my professional standing and character. The medical journals all over the United States have really been unstinted in their praise of the attitude which I assumed regarding the plague, and my actions in carrying out the law and regulations, and I have the unqualified confidence, you may say, of the whole profession in the United States. That is to me of more value than any word of praise which could emanate from Dr. Wyman or anyone connected with the Marine Hospital Service. San Francisco had one final humiliation waiting before it would let Kenyon leave. On the day that he was scheduled to board a train eastward with his family, he was arrested while riding an early morning ferry to Tiburon. A deaf and mute man had come forward with the story that Kenyon had fired several rounds of a rifle at his boat as it passed by Angel Island, each one barely missing his head and tearing holes in his sail. Police officers hustled Kenyon before a judge that same morning to answer to a charge of attempted murder. Angry and stunned, Kenyon testified that he had not fired the shots and instead had saved the man's life. Marine Hospital Service officers at Angel Island had noticed the boat and wrongly assumed that it carried an escapee from the nearby island prison of Alcatraz. Kenyon, hearing the commotion, had raced out of his laboratory and ordered his men to stop shooting. The judge dismissed the charge, though the damage had been done. Kenyon had come to San Francisco expecting that he would continue to push science forward and help change the world. Now, he slunk away in defeat, with newspapers gleefully reporting on his arrest as if intent on seizing their one last chance to defame him. As he boarded a train that would take him away from a city he loathed, Kenyon remained haunted by his professional failures. Plague was still there, and it was spreading. He prayed that whoever replaced him would find a way to accomplish what he could not.